Now, this is a story that will leave you reeling in shock and horror at how people can do the most unspeakable acts to another human being, or in this case, multiple human beings. The sheer evil and brutal manner will stop you in your tracks, and I will leave you to grasp what I'm saying when you see this entire video. Folie à deux, the delusion or mental illness shared by two people in close association, and this story is an exact exemplification of this saying. Now, this is the story of Leonard Thomas Lake, who was born on the 29th of October 1945 and is also known as Leonard Hill and a variety of other aliases, and who lived with his wife. He was an American survivalist and serial killer, and during the mid-1980s, Lake and his accomplice, Hong Kong-born Charles Ng, had formed a union from hell. Between 1983 and 1985, Leonard Lake and Charles Ng kidnapped, tortured, raped and murdered up to 25 people, mostly women, at a remote cabin near Willisville, California, 150 miles east of San Francisco. The scope of their crimes is still undetermined, as is the total of their victims. The human remains, videotapes and journals found at his cabin later also confirmed Charles Ng's involvement and were then used to convict Ng on 11 counts of capital murder, so that he did not evade justice. The two serial killers, Leonard Lake and Charles Ng, had met one another through an advertisement Lake had placed in a survivalist magazine, and whilst he owned a small motel in California. Charles Ng had escaped from a military prison following a conviction for weapons theft and stayed at the Lake's motel, eventually moving into a house along with Lake and his wife. Now, several witnesses testified that Lake was a domineering figure in their relationship and that Charles looked up to Lake like a brotherly, fatherly figure. It was in April 1982 when police arrested Lake and Ng on weapons charges, and Ng was returned to Fort Leavenworth to complete his sentence. But at that time, Lake jumped bail and began life as a fugitive, using various aliases and disguises in an attempt to hide his identity. Then in July 1984, Ng rejoined Lake and his wife after he'd completed his sentence and he had been dishonourably discharged. It was around this time when he first stayed in an apartment rented by one of Lake's sisters before moving into an apartment on Lenox Avenue in San Francisco that autumn. Meanwhile, Lake had moved into a remote cabin near Willisville owned by his in-laws, and next to the cabin he had built a structure described in his journals as a dungeon, and where unspeakable crimes were about to be committed. It was now over the next year or so that Lake and Ng began a pattern of rape, torture and murder. Over the next year, as Lake had invited Charles Ng into his dark world of torture and murder, the two of them began their infamous killing spree and stole the identities of their victims so as to procure loans in their name and continue building their survivalist fortress. Lake and Ng had predominantly targeted women, but were not hesitant to abduct entire families, yes, entire families, to satiate their cravings to kill, rape and wipe out entire families, and then remove their bodies in gruesome ways. Yes, the cabin had become a chop shop. The two men would hold both male and female victims in the 6.5 by 3.5 foot cinder block bunker with only a bucket and toilet paper inside. The bunker was also lined with a one-way mirror so they could see their victims. So the MO was always the same. After killing the men and children to get them out of the way, Lake would then hold the women captive in that custom-built room in the bunker at the ranch, tie them up and then torture and rape them, and then eventually kill them. Following the murders, Lake would dismember and destroy the corpses of their victims using a trick he learned as a child, dissolving them in various chemicals and acids. Lake allegedly did not allow Ng to enter the rear portion of the bunker, telling him, "That is my domain." Lake also lured men to the compound with promises of work, but would instead rob and murder them, after which Lake stole their identities. After killing the victims by shooting them, they would either bury them in shallow graves on or near the property, or burn them and scatter their bones. Many of them were put in leg irons before these sexual assaults, with some so brutal they didn't even survive that. Others were forced to watch their partners get raped before witnessing their murder. Later, police found over 40 pounds of burned, crushed bone fragments scattered around the Willisville property in a gruesome discovery. Charles Ng was convicted of murdering 11 people, but because of the massive amount of burned, shattered bone fragments found at the cabin, they are thought to have killed as many as 25 people. Lake is also known to have committed several murders without the assistance of Ng, and wrote in his journal that Ng was initially very hesitant to get involved with his plan. In the subsequent investigation, it was also revealed that Lake did 2 tours in Vietnam before he was medically discharged from the Marine Corps in 1971. He suffered a mental health breakdown during the war and was diagnosed with impending schizophrenia. Back in the US and left to his own devices, that trauma led him down a dark path. Though he displayed troubling signs as early as childhood, he would take nude photographs of his sisters and cousins, and he was also involved in mutilating animals. The known victims include Lake's brother, his best friend, his neighbours, multiple people we met through newspaper advertisements, tenants of a boarding house where Lake had rented a room, and even 2 men who had advertised gay sex, one who later survived, and 2 workmates of NG, and so it seemed that no one was immune to their clutches. This union proved to be a match made in hell for leur et deux. American serial killers Leonard Lake and Charles NG went undetected for 2 whole years before they were finally caught. And this happened when in June 1985, their reign of terror ended when NG tried to steal a tool from a hardware store. Lake arrived at the scene to assuage authorities by paying the price of the item, but police began to question the two and quickly found they had stumbled upon a dangerous pair of individuals. They found a gun in Lake's stolen car, which warranted an arrest. However, Lake had prepared for this type of scenario by sewing cyanide pills into the lining of his clothing. He chewed a few of these while in custody, and he died before he could even be tried or imprisoned. With that, his part in this brutal horror story came to an end. NG was found guilty of 11 counts of murder and was sentenced to death, but he remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison. This is because California has not executed an inmate since 2006. Now, this was a couple from hell who inflicted a savage and murderous campaign on unsuspecting victims and who all ended up being gruesomely murdered in a remote cabin, the domain from hell, with these 2 evil killers presiding over your last moments on earth. Just cruel and just so evil. Guys, thanks for watching. I hope to catch you for the next story. Cheers.